Hey, Simon.
Jimothy. Does is Jim short for anything, or is it just Jimothy? And I don't know. Jimothy's not a name, is it?
Jimothy, it could be. It could be my new nickname.
Be.
You could be
Cool.
tagging me now as Jimothy, and now everyone's going to call me that.
I don't know if a nickname can be longer than your actual name. Like, I think it's hard to give Jim. I call you Jay.
Jimbo is a popular one.
Yeah, Jimbo.
The actual name is James. So Jim is weirdly short for James. I don't know why, but that is. So yeah.
I think a lot of those names somehow came from like some weird old rhyming structure. Like, the reason why Dick is short for Richard is because Richard goes to Rick, and then it rhymed with Dick. And you're like, what a ridiculous! Why did that come to me? Like, it just did. That's how nicknames were created back in the day was rhyming nicknames, which is very strange. But so I don't know if there's anything with Jim and James there, or if it's just like, it's close enough.
I have no idea. But we're already the first 30 seconds in, and we're already off the rails here.
We are.
But Simon.
Yes,
we've talked about this a little bit before, but I was thinking, what if we started including some ads in our podcast, to pay some bills, maybe buy some Measure Up swag for us and our guests.
Maybe do a remote recording from Hawaii sometime, the home of analytics.
A Measure Up employee offsite.
There you go.
Hawaii sounds good. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
I think, we should probably start doing this, but, sponsors are going to ask questions like, how big is our audience and what are the demographics, and like, how can we show the ROI of, advertising on the Measure Up show?
Yeah.
And, that's a tricky question. So I thought before we go, build our sales deck and start contacting sponsors, I thought, we should talk to an expert in this area.
Yeah.
An expert in podcast advertising. And our guest today is just that. She's a software engineer turned growth marketer, which is a deadly combination, which deadly in a good way, right? Not in a bad way. I guess I could have worded that better.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
But she's also
off the rails, Jim.
Off the rails. Okay. It's Friday. It's Friday. Got to focus here.
It is.
She's also a frequent speaker at industry conferences like Sub Summit and Brand Insider Summit. Throughout her illustrious career, she's been a growth marketer, an acquisition manager, a CMO, a CEO, a founder, a co-founder at many D2C businesses. And she's currently the head of marketing and growth at Podscribe, which is an automated verification and attribution platform for, you guessed it, podcast advertising. And last but not least, Simon, I think this is our first guest who is a world champion in the classic saddle seat in equitation. I'm not even sure if I said that right, but she's a world champion. So our first world champion.
That's incredible. I don't. Equitation, though, is it different from equestrian? That's the first I'm hearing of this word.
Oh my goodness!
Hold on.
So funny.
Welcome
to the show, Amila Coomber. Sorry, I failed to finish the intro, though. Welcome. It's great to have you here.
Thank you, guys. I'm so excited to be here.
But yeah, I think we need to understand this equitation a little bit better. Is that?
Oh my gosh!
I don't know if
you said it right.
Okay.
Yeah. You said it right. It's really it's a discipline of horseback riding, showing. It's close to dressage, but it's really about like how the horse and the person riding the horse can sort of look together and fit into this, I don't know, whatever they deem as the best head up, body up kind of thing. So that's so funny. I was not expecting you to pull that. that was way back in the early days, but
do my best.
Very good times.
Jim does deep research. He'll be like, and of course in elementary school, she was she won the 100-meter race. So many avenues, but no, it's sorry, you go.
I was gonna say I will need this for my future obituary, so thank you.
Well, I'll be happy to send that over. Yeah.
We established, I think, on back, what was it, like episode, actually it was the very first show, the episode that I was on, and then I just never left, but it was that one where I was like, you should write obituaries, and we found out that was Jim's first job.
Actually did do that.
He actually did write obituaries for the local paper. And that's why he's been preparing for this moment his entire life. Just the intro. The rest of the podcast is whatever. The intro is what people are here for.
Yeah. Which it shows, because most people do drop off.
Yeah.
So maybe we should get to the meat of the episode today, right?
We should.
So yeah, we're talking about measuring podcast advertising, which is an interesting topic, I think, because it doesn't get the play that all of the other major, quote unquote, major channels get, like paid search, paid social, TV, CTV, like everyone talks about that. Everyone mostly, I think, understands how those things work. But podcast advertising is a little different. And I don't think a lot of people understand the mechanics of how it works, and some of the complexities there. And so we want to talk about all of that. But before that, Amelia, I want to give you a chance to give an intro about yourself and about Podscribe, and talk a little bit about how you got to where you're at and the kind of work that you're doing at Podscribe.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know if I can give a better intro to myself than what you did. Yeah, I mean, Podscribe is exactly what you said. We are a pixel based measurement provider for podcast advertising, and I think the interesting thing there is that most brands don't even know that you can pixel a podcast, right? Like everything is historically been measured via use this promo code or go to this vanity URL, and those are all great, but as the technology, as the medium itself has been evolving over the last 15-20 years, pixel based technology or pixel based attribution is really sort of the new frontier there. And really what we like to say is like Podscribe is all about sort of leveling podcast advertising and bringing it to that digital age, and helping measure, channels that have historically not been measured, and all the other ways that, your Facebooks and your Googles and really the digital marketing channels have been.
So as we think about I think framing this up for listeners, we think about, I guess we mentioned paid search earlier, and I think it's somewhat intuitive. And like a lot of folks do listen to podcasts, but they aren't necessarily, I mean, sometimes you get ads that are, I don't know, just they seem like they are a natural part of the show. And then like you go back and listen to it and maybe that ad's changed. Or the worst one is when I listen to a show, like an old episode of a show, and they'll be like, come see us at this event that we're doing. Or there'll be some ad for an event and will have happened 2 years ago. How do you advertise on a podcast?
Oh, such a great question. I mean, there's a number of different ways. I would say to that point, there isn't a direct answer. Getting into podcast advertising as an advertiser or a brand can be really difficult, because really what it is at the end of the day, it's all about relationships, and it's sort of a form of influencer marketing, right? Like, you've got the host, you've got their persona, their voice, and then they've got their audience. And so you have to work with them on sort of turning that into an ad and really, negotiating that relationship. So typically, I would say the most common route is that brands getting into podcast ads will, work with an agency. There's a lot of really, really great, not only just podcast agencies out there, but like, performance marketing driven podcast advertising agencies. And so, that Option Road, Adopter, Right Side Up, there's just a number of different ones that really focus on, helping D2C and high performing sort of direct response brands get into that. So I would say that's the most common, and particularly because those agencies have relationships with the publishers, the networks, and the hosts, so they can negotiate a lot better rates. It's not, podcasting is a one centralized platform. There's no auction buying system, right? So they set the rates, they set the CPMs that they, sort of think are, the best for their host. And then again, it's all about sort of bringing those down or figuring out what's right for you. So I would say that's the most common. The other way is there's a lot of self-service platforms out there. So Acast is, I think they're one of the largest sort of agencies / publishers in the industry. But, for X number of dollars, you can work with them by yourself, go into the platform, create an account, and, do a host read ad right there. Just they send the talking points to the host and all that sort of stuff. So I would say those are the two biggest routes. It's really hard to get started as like, just bringing in an in-house team. Because again, unless you already have those pre-existing relationships to the publishers, again, getting sort of a breadth of, I want to, work across a number of shows and things can be sort of difficult.
Yeah, it feels like hitting scale is it's not a scale play, right? Like there's only so many Joe Rogans and Lex Friedmans and Scott Galloway's out there. Like you could probably go directly to them, but then like, how do you do that at scale programmatically is the tricky thing, right?
Yeah, you're right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Like what Simon was talking about is like there's the host read ads or the baked in ads versus I think you call it DAI, right? Dynamic ad insertion. And like every time I've heard a dynamic ad insertion, it's always very jarring and a very bad experience, because it's like it's not the host reading it. It's not related to the episode or a lot of times the content of the episode. It's just like that, like the only way to get scale is to do it poorly, right? Or am I wrong? Yeah.
Well, I think it's interesting, and actually you just made me think of a really great comparison. So the AI and the programmatic forms, right, where you're listening to a show and all of a sudden some producer, read ad, meaning it's not the host actually talking about it, it's some, random AT&T person or whatever. Those are kind of more similar to like display, right? Like, they actually are scale, they're scale plays, but they're more of like frequency plays in terms of how can we push this person further down the line and make sure, that it's lower CPMs, things like that. And then post-read and brand baked in podcasts and podcast ads, they're sort of more like Google search, right? Where you're already looking for something. You're in the actual episode, you're listening to the host, you're sort of high intent because you love what the host said and you believe, what they have to say. And so you're sort of ready to purchase. But it's interesting. I think that there is a cap to scale on podcast ads for sure, right? I think some of the biggest spenders, they're spending maybe a couple $1 million a month on the platform, and that's huge. But, it's not like Facebook where, we're spending $300 million a year kind of thing. But they can unlock different elements of scale. And I think the key to podcast advertising is obviously getting to larger amounts of scale there, knowing that there's a ceiling, but reaching incremental audiences, not only in terms of people that may have never even heard your brand, they're not reachable on the Facebooks and the things like that. But introducing them to your brand or hitting them with an ad in a medium that isn't as saturated with ads as a lot of other things, where the ad fatigue and the predisposition to being like, oh, I know this is an ad, screw this, is not there. Because podcasts really are, again, an influencer chat, platform and channel. I listen to Andrew Huberman, for instance, when he comes on and he tells me that ice baths have changed his life and he bakes that into the content of the episode. You bet your ass that I got an ice bath 2 months later and I have it right in my backyard. So it's like a friend telling me something. Yeah,
a cupboard full of AG1 and some yerba mate. Just because Andrew said it.
100%. So
gotta get that
you're
sleep
able to
8.5 days.
activate. Yeah, you're able to sleep. Yep, you're able to activate those people and sort of like, again, almost do word of mouth at scale, right? Like, because they like Morbid's one of my favorite shows. And I never met the women, but I totally consider them like my friends. I go in and I listen and I vibe with everything they're saying, and I could totally see me in a room having a conversation with them. And so when they came on and tell me that, they love Pretty Litter for their cats, even though I have a dog, I was like, all right, we're going to train you to use a litter box and we're going to buy some Pretty Litter. So I think that's really, the podcast and the benefit that it can provide for brands.
Mm. And well, there's a lot of interesting pieces as to how this media is transacted. Would you say it's sort of most akin to, I guess, its historic relative or its ancestor, even though it's still alive, is radio in a sense? Is that an apt comparison? Just because of the audio format?
Yeah, sure, for sure. I think in terms of like just the actual like how it's being communicated to a human, yes.
Yeah.
And I think that there are, radio sort of merged into podcasts, right? So a lot of the podcast, industry and the folks in the companies are from that radio industry. But it's things like, video now becoming really prevalent for podcast ads, right? Like it's the number one discovery tool. And even listener for podcasts, outpacing Spotify and Apple Podcasts combined. So I think the interesting thing about what podcasts are is they might not even be called podcasts anymore, because the actual medium and how it's being communicated in whatever format to the listener is really changing. And probably will continue to evolve into something that is absolutely not exclusively audio, but probably more, again, of that like sort of scalable word of mouth, whether that's video, whether that's audio, whether that's GIFs or, Facebook things, whatever.
That's it. Yeah. I mean, when I think about what is it going to be called? I don't know. I feel like society just has such a knack for hanging on to terms that's not even a thing we use anymore. Like, we still call them records. And you're like, do you own a record player? And you're like, no, I listen to it on Spotify, but it's a record. And you're like, I guess, or I don't know, like the floppy icon being the save symbol, or I don't know. I tell my kids I'm videoing them and they're like, what's a video? I'm like, this thing on my phone, I guess, but it's not really. So anyway, I don't know. Podcast seems to have transcended the sort of original meaning of that word anyway, right? Like the whole idea was like, it's on your iPod. But I think that does bring up an interesting question just as it pertains to, how do we measure this? You mentioned something up front, which I think is particularly interesting, and that is this idea of the ability to measure deterministically via a pixel. What does that mean? How are you measuring via a pixel?
Yep. So the technical answer is that we have what's basically called like an ad exposure pixel. And there's two types, I won't get into those, but they basically live in what's called the RSS feed. And the RSS feed is basically like that, think of it as the cloud, holder that then contains all the episode details. And so when you're in Spotify and you're like, hey, I'm listening to the next Morbid episode, you click play, what actually is happening is that audio file of the episode is actually being downloaded to your device. And so we have a pixel, a tag, redirect, basically URL that lives inside of that RSS feed. And so when you click play, what happens right before the episode is actually downloaded and moves over to your device is it redirects, pings our server, and passes back us the IP of that listener, of that ad exposure. And that's, it happens in milliseconds. It's completely unnoticeable to the human eye, but it allows us to grab that ad exposure side. And this is different, right? Where, Facebook, they own their platform. They have, it's all profile based. They know who you are. They know what you're doing. Podcasts, they're decentralized. They're sort of open source in a sense, right? So we are limited in terms of the data that we can grab on that exposure side. And so the one main thing, the most helpful thing when it comes to pixel-based attribution is that IP. And then similar to all of these other channels, we also have a pixel on the advertiser site or their mobile app. And what we basically do is, we match those IPs together. So we can collect the person who was exposed to the ad and listen to the episode, their IP, and then we're collecting the IP of the person who actually purchased, went to the website, filled out a lead, whatever it is, and we say, hey, apples to apples equals apples, attributed conversion. There's other technicalities in that in terms of like nuances, IPs, and whatnot. Probably don't need to go into that, but really that's it. And so we're able to, with pixel-based attribution, provide you with those real-time insights. How many visitors were driven that were exposed to the ad? What was that visitor conversion rate? How many actual pixel-based contributed conversions are we attributing to that, rather than, again, what has historically been used to measure podcasts? How many promo codes did we get? How many people, went to that URL, or how many people entered in, we heard you from a podcast ad in that post-purchase survey. So we're able to capture about 70% more of the conversions. And, we provide ways, conversion windows, adjusting attribution models, bringing in exclusions for you to actually sort of look at that data in a number of different ways that isn't what, sort of receiving end of the campaign static promo code numbers are.
So, okay. So I've got, on the IP piece, like when I'm listening to an episode, I guess my typical listening, there are two core listening habits I have. One is in bed, and obviously I'm like on my home Wi-Fi at that moment in time, and so it's like my IP is probably pretty persistent. But the second, and this is actually probably the more common one, is when I'm out and about, right? Because audio is the greatest format for entertainment in a vehicle or anything that I don't have to watch functionally. So when we're thinking about that, and you're thinking about IP stitching here, is that like stitching with some kind of identity graph to stitch across my household ID and my device IDs? How is that piece working to sort of constrain my external listening behaviors with my home activity?
Great question. And those are the nuances of IPs. And again, like we would rather have, the same amount of data that Facebook and Google have in order to do this attribution, but we can only work around the constraints of, again, how podcasts are being delivered. So to your point, exactly, you might listen, while you're driving on your phone, and then maybe you purchase 7 days later on your computer and a cafe, or maybe you're, purchasing at home. And so there's a lot of different situations where, again, that exposure and that purchase can differ, and those IPs can change. So to your point, we use a device graph. We don't have our own proprietary one. I think that there's a lot of reasons why we went into this not using that. But we work with Tabad, really well known. It's owned by Expedia. But it is Expedia, right? Yeah.
I'm not sure who owns Tabad. I'm very familiar with Tabad though.
Expedian or Expedia. Yeah. But, basically part of the
Experian. I think
Expedia
is I was like, oh, that's interesting. A travel company. But then I hear, travel companies for whatever reason have like crazy budgets. Priceline was apparently the number one advertiser on Google for like 5 years. It's nuts. Yeah. Anyway, so you work with Experian and the core Experian identity graph.
Yep.
Okay.
Basically, we're able to, on, specifically like the actual conversion side, if it's happening on, because there's two types of IP types, right? When there's like a static and residential, where you're either in your home or, you're basically you're in an area where there are not a bunch of other people sharing that same IP. So if you're in a coffee shop listening to a podcast ad, for instance, you are, using that public Wi-Fi, and there could be 15 other people listening to something else and being on the same IP. And so, what would be bad is if we were to say, oh, hey, that person, I'm listening to this Athletic Greens ad on my, on this podcast, and then somebody, coincidentally 15 feet from me is renewing their Athletic Greens purchase, right? There are some attribution companies that don't really take that into consideration. They say, hey, two IPs match, like we're considering that a conversion. So when we see these noisy IPs, and we've got, tons of libraries basically that we use to be able to identify those, what is noisy and what static / residential, we're able to grab that noisy IP, look at, some of the other data points that were given. So for instance, like, user agent pair. Sometimes we get the mobile ad ID, and we pass that back to our device graph partner. They're able to, again, extrapolate and what that person's residential IP is. And so it doesn't work for 100% of the IPs, right? I would say about 30 to 40% of any podcast like episode, they're going to contain noisy IPs. And then the rest of them are going to be static. And so we're able to, using TapAd, collecting, other points of data like hashed emails on the actual conversion side, we're able to denoise and match those devices and those IPs across their different sort of counterparts by about 20 to 30%. So we can get about like 60 to 70%, we are matching in a sense one-to-one attribution. And then that other 20 to 30%, we're doing what's called modeling, right? Is we're basically extrapolating out what that performance could look like if we were able to track those people, understanding, based on like statistically significant data and stuff, that there's no reason why these sets of users, just because we can't track them, would engage with the ad any differently. So again, we'll sort of apply the conversion rate from the ones we can match to the noisy ones, and the amount of those get full rounded performance. But in Podscribe in particular, there's also ways to remove that modeling. So you sort of have the options to look at it cohesively, round out that performance, or just look at your direct order IDs associated with actual exposures.
Yeah, it's interesting because as someone who admittedly takes a big dump on multi-touch attribution or attribution in general, a lot of times I've tried to soften my approach a little bit, but like it's easy to point out the discrepancies or the pitfalls. Like, oh, you're if I listen on my phone at work, but then I buy on my home computer, you're not matching that. But you can point out all of the different scenarios where it breaks. But like you said, you're still doing some smart things behind the scenes with device graphs and things like that. So getting as much as possible that you can. But what I find interesting is that this is a particular medium that otherwise you basically have nothing, right? Or you have offer codes like go to sleep8.com/Lex to buy your Sleep 8 mattress.
You can remember that, right?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And like I think you mentioned previously that there's a certain rate of people that actually use the offer code vanity URL or whatever like that. What is that?
It's only about 30% of people that actually
30%.
Well, I had an issue a few years ago with a client I was working with where they were advertising on the Stephen A. Smith podcast. And it was a host rate spot, and they gave out a vanity URL, which was client.com/Stephen A. And I thought, oh, there might be a couple ways to spell Stephen A. And we proactively went and said, we'll give it the VEN and we'll give it the THEN. But no one's going to have a variant on A. Or you would be surprised by the volume of 404s that were generated in the wake of that moment. And it was already it was a sunk cost because they'd already spent so much on the placement. Like there was no getting that back. It was already out there in the world. You can't change the media at this moment in time. So fortunately, we had some anomaly detection on, so we were able to start tracking all this massive spike in 404s, and we were able to create redirects in that space. But that does seem like just one, such a fundamental issue with that approach in the broader sense. And then two, I'll be very honest, and this is like people who take a link and they're like, I'm just going to cut these UTMs out and put it over here. I'm like, don't do that. I still want that. But I absolutely will not type in that name. Because I'm like, what? Am I going to get a different discount? Because they'll be like, give 15% off with my code. And I go to the website, it's like, give 15% off either way. And I'm just like, I will go either way.
Yep.
Yes.
No, exactly. I mean, and the most, common experience, right, is that, you hear of this brand, you hear of Athletic Greens, and you're like, awesome, I want to go buy Athletic Greens. Andrew Huberman told me about it. You're going to go Google that. What are you going to get? You're going to get a Google search ad, a branded search ad. You're going to click on that, and Google's going to say, hey, look, we drove a conversion, right?
Exactly.
Very few, normal consumers are clicking on the organic result, which even then it would, that organic would get it. But, Jim, to your point, I think, what we try to say is it's about pixel progress, not perfection, right? There's always going to be some semblance of modeling. There's always going to be nuances and things like that, but we are making progress, and we're enabling brand advertisers, publishers to be able to scale this channel in ways that they never were, because we are bringing that performance marketing on digital sort of technology to what has historically been a non-digital and offline channel. So never going to be perfect, but I can tell you the number of case studies we have where, brands, we gave up on podcasts, we bring them back in and they're like, wait, I can see episode by episode, show by show, campaign by campaign, like what visitor numbers look like, which one actually drove that last click conversion or last listen. It's pretty astonishing. So definitely about progress and not about perfection. And again, we are always trying to provide transparency. Like we don't have a proprietary methodology. We don't have, our own device grab, right? Like it's all, you can turn on the modeling, you can turn it off. You can see what, other channels, this person was exposed to, what number of ads. We want to provide that flexibility so that you can make the decisions that are best for your brand, and not pretend that, again, there isn't any modeling or there isn't any sort of element of like view through, sort of attribution really is what it is in here.
Yeah. So one thing that we've been focusing on like podcasting and advertising and podcasts, but we do this. A lot of other podcasters have started doing this or have been doing this, which is, we're recording here in Squadcast. We're getting the video and the audio. We post the podcast. We post it on YouTube. And so now we have like YouTube streaming. We have the podcast. And now YouTube, obviously, very angry about this, but they killed off their podcast player in favor of now YouTube Podcast, which is very upset about that. But it is what it is, right? That's becoming a big player now. So like, how do we think about, what is how are we measuring podcast advertising? Are we thinking about streaming on YouTube differently? Do we lump that together? How do we measure that? Like help us out here.
Yeah.
How do we look at all this?
Like pixel-based attribution was the most innovative, thing that's happened in the industry in a long time. This stuff, what we call basically simulcast. So it's your simultaneously casting podcast and audio, or podcast and video, right? So like you guys will put this episode, exact same thing, right, on YouTube probably. Mm-hmm. And those selling of those ads is becoming more and more popular. It's basically part of your media plan now. And that what is going to happen, how you can measure those things in a pixel-based manner is the biggest conversation right now. So there isn't a concrete answer. I think that there is zero doubt in any of our minds that Google is by killing Google Podcasts, despite what it might seem, where they're like, oh, they don't really care about it. I think they're trying to consolidate platforms. I think they're trying to bring things into YouTube. I mean, like I said, YouTube surpassed Apple and Spotify in terms of not just discovery of podcasts, but also listening. So more people are listening and watching podcasts on YouTube than they are these other players. And so we believe, and I think the industry believes that in the next year or so, we're going to see some really interesting things that YouTube does in terms of being able to monetize what are, I would call sort of like an embedded ad inside of YouTube, right? It's not you're running pre-roll, mid-roll, post-roll, sort of ads through Google Ad Manager. These shows are basically just, they say the ad in the episode and that's how it lives. And then you just have to, say that it's sponsored. So I think we're going to see some interesting things there. The difficulty with measuring what we again called simulcast, measuring, if I were to say an ad right now and we're trying to figure out how much did YouTube drive in terms of conversions, is that YouTube doesn't pass anything back to us, right? So,
right.
They're not giving us, emails, they're not giving us profiles, they're not giving us IPs. And it'll be interesting to see how that changes. Maybe, again, they bake it into Google Ads Manager, and now an attribution provider like Podscribe is going to have a third-party pixel that lives in YouTube. There are some workarounds in terms of like TV 360. And those are all really interesting, but that is really the next frontier. And that sort of goes back to what we were talking about, how podcasting itself is not just going to be audio. It's not just going to be podcasts. It's actually merging into this much larger medium. And video is, I think at the forefront of that. I mean, not to mention, right? Like you hear me talk about AG1 or let's say like HexCloud. I think they're that like awesome pan company, right? I could tell you about the features and how sleek it looks and stuff, but could you imagine me like grabbing the pan right here and being like, guys, like look at this, like that is so much more convincing and can really convert at a higher rate than I think even the audio version. So people know that, and we're trying to figure out ways to sort of work with YouTube to figure out what that is right now. To I think maybe answer your question more directly. Again, there is no way to measure. Nobody has an exclusive partnership with YouTube where they're passing back data so that you can measure in a pixel-based standpoint. A lot of, companies are relying on UTMs, right? So in the, below the fold notes or whatever, you actually have that URL. Here are the sponsors, easier to click. And that's the other exciting thing about, YouTube, right? Is there actually is a click that can be had rather than for podcasts. So really what we do is we automatically pull in those YouTube views for the episode that your ad was in. And then again, if you would like to see what the results could look like, we'll model those for you in the exact same way that we would model noisy IP. So we would say, hey, here's the podcast, 1-to-1 RSS feed conversion rate. Let's say it's 2%. You had, 15, 100, whatever views on YouTube where your episode was listened. And let's apply that 2% conversion right there and show you what those conversions could look like. So not perfect, again, full, control in terms of turning it off, but that's how us and any other brand or advertiser attribution provider doing this is doing it right now.
Does that, by the way, in any way enable like dynamic feedback loops in terms of I'm just thinking about every other form of digital media being somewhat guided by pixel signals. And I wrote an article a while back that I called the PMaxification of everything. And the core idea there is that there are still some mediums that will not be PMaxified. Podcast is one of them for the moment, just because of the fragility and fragmentation that exists across the ecosystem to sort of mitigate that unified signal. But the question I would have is like, measurement in the absence of ability to affect change is interesting but not useful. And so the question I have here is how, if at all, is that signal then being used to control in a sort of programmatic capacity the, I don't know, playing an ad more or reinserting it over and over or right.
It's not there. There isn't. They don't have that conversion data. So even the large programmatic partners, and we're starting to talk with them about this sort of thing, because that is the future of it, right? I mean, first we've got to sort of move away from this like static CPM, like we give you the cost kind of thing. There's probably a world where podcasts are actually bought in an auction-based format, and programmatic offers that to a certain extent. It's not as comprehensive as, the Google and things like that, but you can, again, set your criteria and you'll get a certain CPM based off of that. But they don't have that conversion data. And that's why a company like Podscribe is so powerful. Because we've been doing this so long, we have, we work with the largest advertisers, we work with the largest publishers in the podcast ad space. We have so much data that, we don't sell media. We're not doing any part of the buying. So we're not using it in terms of like, here's, we're trying to provide just insights into like, here's where you should buy us based on your sort of data and the reporting. But I really do think that's where it's going to go. And I think YouTube's going to be a big part of that, right? Like you can, when you start to sort of centralize that stuff, when you have something like the stat that YouTube is the number one, player for podcasts, the opportunities to be able to understand how people are engaging with these ads, with, like, again, what other things they're doing across, Google search and stuff like that. I think that's probably the only way. So I don't know if that answers your question, but right now, totally the conversion, the data and stuff is not being used. These programmatic, providers, they can accept third-party pixels. They don't have their own. So they're not actually providing direct attribution. That's why, a company like Podscribe or Claritas or Art's Eye sort of comes in. But I think working with the programmatic providers, working with the Google, having the access to that data and then sort of using that to be able to optimize and focus on where those ads should be and things like that is sort of, the next 5-10 years of podcasts.
Yeah, no, it's certainly really interesting to think about that. And then when we talk about YouTube, I go, well, that's a boon for advertisers because Google Pixel and it's in a walled garden. And I think about the sort of, if Google gets their act together with ADH, like that's really powerful in terms of having a clean room component associated with this, and the ability to look across potentially the podcast audience and the ads being served. But like, I don't know, when I think about the future, and heck, even when I think about now, because I think, when Jim and I talk about being these sort of recovering MTA-aholics, it is a pendulum, and we realize that we sort of swing in both directions at different times, and that there's outright rejections of, like, I think, oh gosh, I was a heretic to say those things, but it's good that I had that experience. The point I'm sort of hovering around here is there may be a reality where IP address truncation comes into play in a larger capacity, and we start to lose these deterministic signals. Not in the sort of broadest sense in terms of being able to target, but certainly in the individual addressable, did this person explicitly convert? And that is where and why I think our industry has made such a big move toward media mix modeling. So I'd love to just get a pulse on the, and Jim too, I'm sure you've done a lot of these, or maybe you haven't, I don't know, but like, what are we thinking of in terms of how do you handle podcast advertising measurement within an MMM right now? Is it possible?
Yeah, I think
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think you hit a couple of questions in there, right? Like,
Yeah.
I think we should touch on like what happens if IP addresses are inaccessible. Like, I think there are some workarounds there, but that's like one thing. But yeah, in terms of other ways of measuring, like podcasts are not as straightforward as other channels, right? It's not like, you're pulling in your daily spend on Google paid search and your daily revenue and your daily spend in Facebook and Instagram and TikTok, and maybe you have CTV spend and all this. You're getting that on a daily level, and you basically, you're paying for it on this day and you're getting it on this day, right?
Sure.
Whereas things like affiliates and influencers and podcasts kind of don't fit that paradigm, right? Because you might have, let's say you have a one-off deal with Lex Friedman and Joe Rogan and Scott Galloway, and you're advertising on the podcast. You're giving them a lump sum, today for, a 12 episode deal or whatever, however they charge that, right? And so right off the bat, you're figuring out, okay, how do I model that spend? Do I model it every day? Do I model it for when the podcast is released? But just because they release a podcast doesn't mean that's when someone's going to listen to it. So sorry, I've been going on too long, but yeah, it's not the most straightforward channel to measure with MMM. You can do it because you have to be very thoughtful about how you do it. But I know you had mentioned, I think, Amelia, that you are able to kind of feed data into MMMs. Is that correct?
MMMs and AMTAs. And so again, to your point, without pixel-based attribution for podcast advertising, yes, you're spending $12,000, $50,000, whatever. Joe's going to do 3 episodes. Here's the number of impressions you're going to hit. And then you can look at that at the end of the day. And a lot of what, historically these MMM, sort of companies and things would do is they just look at, site traffic correlation in terms of when the ad went live. With, a company like Podscribe, right, we are, the way that you buy podcast ads, similar to sort of Facebook, right, is on a CPM basis, right? So you are spending a certain amount, $25, $20, whatever, per, sort of 1,000 impressions. And so as that money is, as those impressions are being delivered, sure, there's like, hey, we want to spend $25,000 in total, but like Podscribe, for instance, you can see in your dashboard, like how much of that has been sort of, allocated, how much of that is gone. So you actually can see, all right, we've delivered 50% of the, 100,000 impressions. We spent $10,000. And so that means we're spending whatever that math is, right? So with pixel-based attribution, and again, it's newer. So, forming these for partnerships with MMMs takes a little bit of time. But like we can actually feed that data into them with real time. And they'll still do that sort of correlation stuff, but they'll have some other data points alongside of it. So that is possible now.
This is breaking my mind now. Like, 'cause I just always assumed that the way that podcast advertising worked is that, you paid you paid once, and then you basically paid like an estimated CPM, and they said, oh, well, here's how many average downloads per episode I get, and then you'd kind of pay based on that. But no, you're saying I don't know why I just thought it was always that way, but it makes sense. Yeah, you're paying.
And it probably was, right? We weren't able to track those things as much. We weren't able to see like, historically, again, outside of just like capturing all the conversions of pixel-based stuff and whatnot, what it used to look like was like, hey, one, I want to make sure my ad actually ran, publisher, can you send me the air check? And two, like, hey, we want to see the results. They would literally, the publishers would send them a CSV of like the impression, like line item by line item, day by day. And you get that, 2 months after the campaign actually ran. So in those situations before pixel stuff, yes, that was the case, right? There was a lot of conversation about, are we even delivering the same number of impressions? And that's why Podscribe does, a verification component, right? We're actually monitoring how the impressions are being paced. Yes, podcasts will over deliver again, because it's not, like you tell Facebook, I want to spend $10,000. They give you the CPM and they're going to spend that $10,000. Probably not much more. So, yes, if an ad goes viral or something on YouTube or on the podcast, you could be paying a certain number of impressions and get some more. And that's all great. And if you don't get the same, the total impressions, then that's, what a lot of brands will sort of consider like a make good, and they'll get another free ad or whatever. But yes, with pixel-based attribution, you actually can see how those impressions are being delivered. And then again, what that sort of like, real-time spend associated with the number of impressions based on that CPM looks like. So you can feed those things into the attribution models and MTAs.
That's amazing. Yeah, and it kind of goes back to the scale issue, right? Like if you're just doing these like one-off deals and you're like 5 years ago, whatever, and you're waiting for the podcaster to send you a CSV file of how many downloads they had per day, like that's not scalable. But at least this way you can scale a little bit better, right? You can
absolutely, and it's really like. It'd be like throwing spaghetti at the wall, right? Like if I told Facebook that I wanted to spend $50,000, I wanted to go after this people and I wanted this ad, and then 2 months later they were like, hey, like here's what you like, nobody would buy in the channel. And as a somebody who worked in performance marketing and led those teams, that was one of the reasons why I didn't, really try to test out podcast ads, because I was like, I not only do I know that I'm not capturing all the things that I can capture in terms of what's attributed, but like, there's no way for me to optimize. Like, what person looks at their Facebook reporting a month after the ad goes live and is like, oh, here's how we did. Now what will we do next, right? No, you push those ads live, you get that copy in there, and you're looking, every single day. What is that click-through rate? What is that view-through rate? How did the CPM change, right? And those are all things not just from a reporting standpoint that you need, but from an optimization standpoint. And so again, pixel-based attribution, again, capture 70% more conversions, but also treat it like every other digital marketer expects when it comes to a marketing channel, with the ability to get this data so that you can optimize. You can turn things on, turn things off, move things around based on what that performance looks like. And that is sort of the future of podcast ads. That's what a lot of this radio people that have sort of, come into the space don't really have experience with, because it has all been static. And that's really what Podscribe's sort of mission is to, provide the level of, ad tech transparency and, sort of real-time reporting that, all of these advertisers, working for companies focusing on direct response require in order to even test out the channel.
And sorry, this is true for baked in, like, because I was thinking, Jim, about the example you were giving too, because you're talking about Scott Galloway, and like, when I think about the ads, the host rate, like they are, I guess I look at my Spotify app sometimes when they're playing, I'm like, it's not showing me like the ad window that I would see from these ones that are dynamically inserted. It is clearly just like part of the recording for that show. And also, it's clearly curated to a degree, because he's like, I'm an investor in public and I do da 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 da. And then he reads the ad. And I guess I'm wondering in that capacity, like that operates in the exact same way that the dynamic insertion ones do.
A little different, obviously. If it's going to live in the episode forever, right? It depends on the type of content, right? You're probably not going to go and watch a 2-year-old news episode, but maybe I would go back and watch one of the first Morbid episodes because I got to get myself caught up. So it depends. But yes, in theory, you'd be able to, you're getting the same, the episode is going live. Here's how many impressions we expect it to be. Again, it could overpace, it could underpace. Usually they give themselves like a window. So we want to make sure we hit this number of impressions in 60 days rather than like, we're only going to be delivering it to this percentage of the audience and we can guarantee we hit that impression number. So again, it can over deliver and things like that. But yeah, we get that real-time data for even those sort of baked in things. And then that's what we can feed back into the models. It's just going to differ in terms of when those impressions come, because again, they could come 5 years later too. And we can still attribute those things and all that stuff. But just operates a little bit differently in terms of how it's being delivered.
A strange thing that I like to do is I like to go back and listen to news podcasts from right around the time of the COVID shutdown. Just to like listen to like, what were they talking about? And they're like, well, the world is ending, people, and everything is turning to shit. And, just like, or like, I don't know, the audacity of hope that some of them had of like, it's going to be amazing and all these things.
It's just 2 more weeks.
Right. Yeah, exactly. They'll just, what was it? Depress the curve. I can't remember what we were saying. It was something like that. Yeah. Was it depress the curve? That doesn't sound bad. It was, I don't know. Stop the whatever. 2 weeks of it is all it can take.
Wash your fruits and vegetables, people.
Yeah, and Clorox your shopping bags. Those are the key takeaways. Jim was telling Amelia he got strep throat somehow during COVID, which I'm just like, how does that happen? No one got sick during COVID.
Yeah, barely went out at all. We washed all of our groceries when we got home with the Clorox wipes, and somehow still managed to get strep throat. But yeah,
good time. No, this is if you had to maybe prognosticate just about the future of measurement in this space, because I think there are fundamental needs here, not just at this macro level, but about the feedback methods and loops. Do you think it's viable that we're going to get to that point that we will have creative intelligence? Like all these, the advancements that are happening in these other platforms are just so rapid, and I know we're in the infancy here, but it's just like there's so much more that I want from a measurement point of view that I just don't feel prepared for.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that, again, one of the first things you have to do, or that you require when you run podcast ads is like, I want to listen to the ad. I want to see it. I want to see the word. So we transcribe every, all the shows, all the episodes, we auto label them. And whenever you're, piping a campaign in Podscribe telling us to measure something, one of the first things you're going to get is the actual air check. So I think in that sense, because everything is transcribed. We also have the audio file, right? So there are really interesting things that can come about. So, whether it's sentiment analysis, whether it's relating it contextually to other parts of the episode. We have trained ChatGPT models in terms of like, what's the best host read ad? How can we score these sorts of things? So I think absolutely one of the, and creative is sort of the last lever that you can pull in any digital marketing channel now in terms of improving efficiency, because, tracking is just getting harder. And I think for podcast ads, it's the same thing. So yeah, there's a lot of companies out there that really specialize in like AI contextual targeting. I think that we're going to see some other interesting stuff about like, all right, if I'm, going to run an episode on Joe Rogan, let's say I have I'm an Athletic Greens or something. How can we sort of take all of the transcripts of his episode, summarize them, give me, sort of content that maybe we could instruct him in terms of how we want to relate that ad back. So maybe, let's say we're a, Liquid IV hydration company, and we get to see like, oh, hey, Joe talked about his mother's hydration problem and how she, it caused inflammation and whatnot. Why don't we like, create an ad and have him sort of, merge the, Liquid IV with that sort of conversation the audience has already been exposed to. So I absolutely think a lot of things like that are happening. And I think they're only going to continue, especially, because podcast tracking, I don't think is ever going to get easier. I mean, if everything moves away from the RSS to like streaming, which is a whole nother conversation, might be a little bit different. And I think that there, that sort of gets into like, again, who's hosting the podcast. Is it the RSS feed? Is it Spotify? Things like that. So I don't think that tracking will ever get any easier necessarily. It's not in the next, couple of years. But I think that the focus on how can we deliver the best creative, how can we, sort of marinate it into the context of the episode, is now really, really top of mind for podcasters, where that's been top of mind for other digital marketing channels for the last 3 years,
Yeah. Liquid IV, by the way, is a really interesting brand. And this is not sponsored. They are a Tenuity client. And I was actually chatting with some of their folks, and they just love being the first movers on things. So I'd be so intrigued to see what they're doing in the world of podcasts. I need to look into that.
Larger spenders, have been doing it for forever. They look at it as both like sort of a brand awareness thing, which really podcasts are, but also then you can sort of merge the direct response perspective. They're really great, and they really focus on the creative as well, and especially with their new mission about it. It's not for athletes, right? It's for everybody, and they do a great job of that with the host read ad.
I feel like the Pedialyte need to get the Stanley Cup guy. They need to get him and make Pedialyte cool, because Pedialyte's the OG of this hydration game, and yet here they are just being like, well, that's a beverage for babies. No adults going to drink that.
They
tried a little, but like Stanley Cup, I don't know what they did special. I know they did a lot of things, but they just became like a cultural icon. And you look at it and you're like, 120 years old. Like they have no right reinventing themselves like this, but incredibly interesting.
Yeah, Pedialyte needs to just remove the sugar. And I think that people down. I think that's probably the biggest thing. But so interesting.
Well, as I feel like we could keep going on. I know I say this every episode, like we could go on forever, and the 3 listeners that have asked us to have longer episodes would want us to.
One's for you.
But all of the others are
Hello, Mike Kelly. He was the one who told me he wanted 2 3-hour episodes. So Mike Kelly, this one's for you. It's not for you. We're actually going to end the episode.
Yeah, we're actually going to.
But one day I'll just, I don't know, I'll put it on like half speed for him so he thinks it's twice as long.
Yes. But in the spirit of today's episode, today's Incremental Insight is brought to you by Good and Gather.
Oh,
caffeinated.
Is it?
Caffeinated Dr. Cherry Vanilla Sparkling Water from Target.
The
Good and Gather brand. And if anyone in Target is listening and does want to sponsor the podcast, if you want to send me like 10 cases of bubbly water, that's all it'll take.
Absolutely. Also by Walgreens Oral Elite Antiseptic Spray. God, we mentioned so many brands today. This really is like a little ad. It's but sorry, Jim, I interrupting your flow.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So that's our unofficial sponsors for the episode.
Indeed.
But it is time for the Incremental Insight, where our guest shares a amazing resource, valuable tidbit, a link to an article, a video, a podcast, or something that they think would be extremely useful for our audience. So, Amelia, what do you have for us?
Yeah. I mean, every quarter we put out what we call like the PPB, the Podscribe Performance Benchmark Reports. And it's basically, with all the data that we have across all the advertisers and the shows and things like that, here are the trends in terms of what average visitor rate looks like, what conversion rate looks like, what genres are performing the best, what performs best, host read or producer read, do 30-second ads perform better than 60-second ads. So, I'll share the link with you guys, but would love, for people, if they have any questions about, what, now that I can measure my podcast ads, how do I know if it's good or if it's bad? I think, again, that's really unique about podcasts. We all know you should be hitting a 3% conversion rate in Facebook or on your e-com site, but because this sort of technology is so new to podcasts, we get questions all the time. Well, how do I know if a 1% visitor rate is good or bad? So would love to offer that. I think one of the biggest interesting insights in that report really actually comes down to like ad length. And there's a lot of debates around, especially when it's like host read ads. 30 seconds, 60 seconds, 100 seconds, whatever it is. And the finding is that for host read ads in particular, the longer the ad, we see a direct correlation. It's actually a correlation coefficient of about 0.83 relating to like performance increasing. That differs from the different ad types. But when you let the host sort of do their thing and talk organically about something, even that if that, extends longer than 60 seconds, again, which is different than like a Facebook or, what other channels, we see a direct correlation to performance increasing.
I'll tell you who's absolutely wild, by the way, on the crazy host rate stuff is Jim Jeffries. If you listen to the I Don't Know About That podcast, he'll just be like, Shopify. What is Shopify? It's a website. This is crazy. What do they sell? And then he just opens the website. He's like, they sell websites. Okay. Oh, they power the Jim Jeffries store. Did you know this? I'm like, Jim, did you prepare for this episode?
Yeah.
Or is it part of the lunatic Australian vibe you're going for? I think
yes.
It's a combination of the two.
Yeah.
Sorry, Jim. I cut you off there.
No. I was just gonna say, I feel like any length for a hosted ad that's not 15 or 30 seconds or multiples of those is going to be tops, because like as soon as I hear the ad, I'm like, hit the skip 30 seconds, hit this. Until it's like back to the show. I know I feel a little bit hypocritical saying that, but hey.
But if you're in your car, it's really hard to do that. So
not with Android Auto.
Oh, there you go. Sponsored
just
by
got it
Google.
right up on the top.
Well, and again, there's obviously caveats to that stat, right? Like if the host comes up and says, "Hey, we want to introduce you to our sponsor," now you're the first thing you're going to do is skip. But it does really, really well, specifically when that host does a really great job of narrating it into the content. Obviously, they need to disclose that it's an ad, and so we do that. But that was really interesting. And I'll give one more too, if that's okay. Pre-roll actually outperforms mid-roll from all of the data, and that's a podcast specific. Like you just have to sort of be in the industry to understand like how jarring that is. But mid-roll, in the middle of the episode is usually the most expensive. You're going to be looking at probably a 2x cost in terms of CPM to a pre-roll. But we find that early in the episode that ads are the higher they perform. And again, nuances and things like that. But we've done some really, really interesting incrementality, like conversion lift and A/B tests. Same show, same audience kind of stuff, one or the other. And pre-roll, not only are, it's half the cost, but you're seeing 2x the conversion rate. So fascinating stuff.
Yeah, that is worth
buy that. Yeah.
Wow. I feel so bad for everyone who dropped off already, because they just missed the most valuable piece of information in the whole episode. Like, that's like dollars in the bank right there. That's awesome.
That's right. That's for you, Mike Kelly. Oh gosh. Well, when you're sitting there and your media manager is talking to you and they're going, why do we have 12 different redirects for a Stephen A. Smith vanity URL? Maybe there is a better way to think about podcast measurement, and maybe you want to consider some degree of deterministic attribution. Perhaps you'll find yourself being able to measure up.